Well, it's that time again. It's time to change the rear brake pads on my 2008 Suzuki Reno. My name's How To Bob, and here's how I go about doing that. First thing I'm going to start off with is getting the brake pads ready, and by getting them ready I mean putting on the disc brake quiet compound. And what I do is just lay out my brake pads, and this is the first step I do because this compound usually takes about 10 to 20 minutes depending on the temperature to dry. So I put a little bit on each pad and then I smear it around to make a nice even coat, and this will keep the brakes from squealing later on. And once I get that done, I'll just smear a little bit around each one, make sure I get a nice even coat. Once I get that done, I need to address the safety. So what I'm going to do is put a wheel chuck under the front tire to keep the car from rolling while I go around to the back here, and I'm going to jack up the back right wheel, and I only need to jack it up just enough to get the tire off the ground, so don't have to jack it up a whole lot, just enough to get it off the ground so I can get the tire off. And once I get the car jacked up high enough, I'm going to take my 3/4 inch socket and I'm going to take the wheel cover off. This wheel cover is held on by 4 plastic decorative type nuts. They're just held on to the lug nuts underneath, and then you just gently pull out on the wheel cover and some of the nuts will fall off. You can see that they're threaded on the inside, and then they just screw over the top of the lug nuts. So it's a real simple system, but yet it helps hold on the wheel cover. Now I can go ahead and take off my wheel here. I'm using a 3/4 inch impact driver, and I'm going to take all 4 lug nuts off and pull the tire. Once I get my tire off, you can see here I've got a 14mm wrench, and I'm going to go ahead and loosen up the 2 bolts here. It's a 14mm, and there's 2 bolts that hold the caliper on. Once I get those loose, I can go ahead and use a socket wrench, help it move along a little quicker. Just take out the 2 bolts holding that caliper in place. Now before I take the caliper off all the way, I want to hang a wire up somewhere in the spring and put a little hook on the end. That way when I do take the caliper off, it's not hanging by the brake line. Now that I've got my coat hanger, wire, whatever you find, hooked up to the spring, I can go ahead and take my caliper off, and I'll hook it onto the wire just so that it doesn't hang by the brake line and do any damage to my brake line. Okay, now that I've got that done, I'm going to go ahead and put my 2 bolts back in loosely just to keep them in place. Then I'm going to take a large channel lock here and compress my cylinder all the way down so that it'll slide over top of the new brake pads real easy. I just want to squeeze that gently and real slow, let the fluid go back into the reservoir. Now it's time to take the brake pads off. There's one on the outside here, and you can see these are a little corroded in there, so I have to get a screwdriver underneath there and kind of pry them off gently. You got to be careful not to damage your rotor, and you can see there's a little life left on these. It looked like they might have been seized up a little bit, but I'll fix that when I put the new ones on by putting some brake lubricant on there. On this inside one here, if I can't get behind here, what I can do is just set the screwdriver on the edge of the pad and tap it out. And out it goes. You can see it's still got a little life. Now I'm going to use some brake lubricant, and what that's going to do is lubricate the channels where the brake pad rides, right here and here. And you can see that the brake pad, all it does is slide in and out on these channels here. So what I'm going to do is take a little bit of the brake lubricant, put a little dab on my finger, and I'm going to rub it around in these channels. You don't want to use a whole lot because you don't want it to get on the rotors or anything, you know, that it shouldn't be on, but I want to put a little bit in there. That'll keep it from rusting, and this is a good brake lubricant. It withstands the high temperatures in the brake area. You just put a little bit on there. A little bit is just fine. So once I get that done and get it all smeared around, I can go ahead and put my brake pads in those channels there. Just set it in the bottom one, and it'll slide right into the top one, and I push it into place, and then I can go with the outside brake pad the same way. You can see the little tabs on there that'll go into the channels. I just take it and set it in the bottom one and push it in the top. Now I'm ready to put my caliper back in place, but before I do that, I'm going to take these two nuts here, and since this is a brake system, it's very essential that they work. I'm going to use some thread locker. I'll put just a little dab on here. This is a removable, like a Loctite or a thread locker. I'll put a little dab on the tip of each one of these, and this is removable, so I'll be able to take it off next time I have to change the brake pads. And I can take my caliper off the hanger that I have and just simply slide it around the two brake pads here and line up the two holes, and then put my two bolts back into place. And I want to put them in, start out by putting them in hand tight to make sure that I don't cross thread any of the bolts, do any damage to the bolts or any of the brake pieces. So I'll just put that in as far as I can by hand, and then I'll get my ratchet out. It's a 14mm ratchet again, and I'll get that as tight as I can. Once I get that all the way as tight as I can by hand, I'm going to go ahead and put the wrench on there and give it a few taps here with a rubber mallet just to make sure that it's tight enough. Doesn't have to be real tight. Don't want to break any bolts or anything, and that'll get it all straightened away. I'm going to go ahead and put the tire back on now. Again, I'm using a 3/4 inch impact on an impact driver here. First, I want to start off by putting my lug nuts on by hand first, again, so I don't cross thread any of the bolts. And when I'm tightening the lug nuts here, I want to go cross from each other, so I want to do one on one side, one on the other side, then I can rotate around, and I want to make sure I hit each lug nut a couple times. And now I'm ready to put my wheel cover back on, and I have to watch where my valve stem is because there's a notch here. So I get that notch lined up here, and I can go ahead and just tap it into place, tap the outside in, and these little plastic lug nuts fall off. So I can just put that back in. It's real easy to put in. Once I get that in, I can use my 3/4 inch socket and just screw the plastic lug nut covers into place. Now that I've got this all back together, I can go ahead and lower the car, take out my wheel chuck, and the one last most important thing to do is to pump your brakes before you drive off. And this is how I changed the brakes on a 2008 Suzuki Reno. This is How To Bob. Thanks for watching.